May 1, 2010. The date sits in the ledger of our lives like a small, persistent scar. We had an address reserved, vendor deposits paid, guests who had taken time off work, and a stretch of park held for us from sunrise until dusk. We had invitations and plans and a sense, however anxious, that a day could be organized into meaning. Instead, my mother chose to erase the day. She cancelled the ceremony at the last minute. She did not call with a steady, explainable reason. She did not offer a narrative that could be folded into anyone's moral imagination. She performed an erasure so precise it read like an accusation. She would make the wedding not have happened. That is the fact I preserve first, before interpretations rearrange motive into meaning. The act was public enough to hurt and private enough to complicate any standard response. It created a string of small legal and logistical failures that had to be addressed, or else the day would be lost not only emotionally but administratively. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of after, grief and humiliation braided together, and practical problems stacked up. I learned the first lesson that would guide the next decade: ceremony survives on logistics. Contracts, witness names, backup plans, these are not the romantic parts of a life, they are its scaffolding. In the kitchen of an apartment that smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and a movie of late sunlight, I sat down and made a checklist. Vendor cancellation clauses specifying required written notice. A list of witnesses who could attest to the plan. A rule that deposits be non-refundable only under enumerated circumstances. Contact information for vendors who would honor small ceremonies despite a fraught family situation. I translated humiliation into procedure. It felt petty at first, paper and signatures, but the practical payoff was enormous. In 2011, I set up a public email address so any couple in a similar crisis could find the checklist. When, years later, a couple wrote asking for help, it was that checklist they wanted. June 12, 2010, 3 weeks after May 1st, we held a re-wed picnic in the park. We called it a re-wed picnic not as rhetoric but as remedy. There was a date, people, food, and an arch. 200 people came, a number that anchors the memory. They brought chairs, desserts, a borrowed Polaroid camera, thermoses of tea, and patience. They sat down and made a thing happen. Those 2 dates, May 1st and June 12th, bracket a lesson and a response. May 1st showed how quickly something public could be made private by someone else's omission. June 12th showed what was possible when people organized to resist that erasure. The picnic was improvisational, cobbled together from the domestic competence of friends and neighbors. It was not legal closure or family reconciliation, it was stubborn insistence that our day exist in the world. September 2010, a recurring impulse hardened into practice. I put out an invite for Found Family Saturday. The name was literal, a Saturday when people who were not kin practiced being kin. The first month a handful came, those handful multiplied. Each Saturday had its architecture. Music began before conversation stalled. I arranged 5 chairs before anyone arrived. There were thermoses and spare chairs and a recipe taped to the fridge. There was a named person responsible for emergency pickups or for an extra child who arrived at the last minute. These were the details that matter when big dramas happen. Over the years Found Family Saturday, they had 1 hour on the phone. I walked them through the checklist line by line, questions for vendors, witness affidavits, a script for a confrontation that wouldn't become fodder for strangers, the logistics of accessible seating, and the list of older relatives who might be susceptible to coercion. They followed the plan. The mother desisted. The couple wrote back a week later saying the ceremony had proceeded in quiet dignity and invited us as thanks. That quiet victory, not dramatic, not headline-making, was the ethical payoff I had hoped for, a domino effect of attention and competence that enabled people to repair fractures themselves. From 2011 onward reporters called, sometimes in the early months and sometimes years later. 2011, 2014, 2017, 2020 and again in 2021, the pattern recurred. Each pitch carried the same implication: supply more humiliation and we will make your story travel. In 2014 a reporter with a sweet, insinuating voice offered to break the story again if we widened the doors to our private life. She promised reach and attention. She promised a wider audience for pain. I said no. Saying no was not moral grandstanding. It was a defense. You do not let strangers monetize the most intimate humiliations of your life. Instead, we learned to hand out what we had: checklists, a community talk, a course called Ceremonies without entitlement, and to offer them in ways that helped people without commodifying our pain. There were sharper collisions with family myth and public expectation. April 3, 2016, the date of my mother's funeral, arrived neither as closure nor as tidy reconciliation. Her death placed old disagreements into ritual frames where they could be rekindled or muted. A distant cousin attempted to revive the family mythology in the church. He stood up and accused me loudly of seeking attention and being dramatic. For a brief instant, I performed the humiliation he expected. I fidgeted, tried to keep the child off stage. But the people who had become our family did not indulge the cousin's spectacle. Priya told him quietly, with a firmness that made the air crack, that grief is not a reality show. August rose and told the cousin to leave the child alone. The cousin sulked out, affronted and small. There was no cinematic victory, only the steadiness of people who would not let someone bully a child. That steadiness is how boundaries are policed, not by torches and drama but by reliable presence. Those presences mattered to the child in precise ways. The child learned these lessons early and often. In September 2015, at 9, leaning on the kitchen counter with the bluntness children are permitted, they asked, "Was Grandma always like this?" They wanted a before, a cause and an arrow between cause and consequence. I told them a child-appropriate version of the truth. People are made of contradictory things. Memory is a collage, not a marquee. My mother had good days and bad days. The child shrugged and went back to their bike. That ordinariness was salvational. There were other formative moments. March 2018. In a classroom where a teacher described our story as a romantic tragedy, the child corrected them. "This was not our tragedy," they said. "This was a cancellation someone made. We had to make our own celebration." The distinction matters. Cancellation is an act. Tragedy is an identity. The child refused identity for action. That refusal came from a long sequence of small, practical corrections. Teaching a polite correction, refusing to be reduced to someone else's curiosity, and repeating routines that countered spectacle. The network's ordinary labors taught the child practical skills. James took them to a local physics club on Saturday mornings. Priya taught them to chop onions without crying and gave them her turmeric rice recipe on a stained card. August taught knots and explained why a particular hitch holds under strain. These are not decorative skills. They are modes of participation in civic life. The child learned that family is a verb, to expect help, to ask for it in concrete terms, and to repay it with the same quiet competence. Calling a neighbor when a light bulb burns out, bringing a thermos to someone convalescing, showing up at a rehearsal with an extra set of hands. Administrative refinements came through trial and error. In 2012, I learned to ask vendors to name substitution clauses. What happens if a vendor cannot supply a service because of a cancellation from one side? In 2015, I refined a clause requiring 2 named backup witnesses to be notified of any change in plans. We circulated templates for what to say to a photographer who posts a photo without consent, and for how to request the removal of an image with precise language about harm. We taught people how to prepare a witness affidavit that would be useful in a legal sense. These acts are armor: a folder with a timeline of the park day, photos with clear metadata, a guest list with contact information. The child learned to carry that folder. Paperwork became preservation as much as photographs on a mantle. Workshops continued to appear in our calendar. In 2012 and again in 2019 we held practical sessions on affidavit drafting, collecting vendor contracts specifying responsibilities, and structuring email threads so there was a written record of cancellations and modifications. The child learned to carry documents: a digital copy of the invite list, an annotated timeline, a folder of photos with intact metadata. The bureaucratic axe hardened into ordinary armor. Not every interference could be neutralized through paperwork. There were petty aggressions and misreadings. In 2015, a local human interest blog published an inaccurate photo and caption. We called and asked for removal. They complied. We did not threaten legal action. We explained the harm in precise terms and asked for remediation. That approach recurred. Instead of escalating, We articulated the specific correction we wanted. Often it worked. Social media, hungry for simplicity, sometimes gnawed at us for not offering a villain in a GIF. We refused to feed that appetite. Silence became, at particular moments, a better tactic than wrath. In 2017, an online commentator tried to reduce the Park Day to a hashtagized drama. We said nothing. The found family continued to live the life and let the noise recede. When reporters called offering reach and clicks in exchange for more detail about the humiliation, in 2014, 2017, 2020, we refused. We handed out what we had in small, useful formats, checklists, templates, and an available voice on the phone for a couple in crisis. This conservative generosity kept the story from mutating into a commodity. Anniversaries, we learned, could be rituals of resistance. We refused to ritualize May 1st. We would have no shrine that invited my mother's absence to instruct us. Instead, we marked June 12th each year, the date of the re-wed picnic. We baked the same lemon cake. Priya brought the curry. James lugged the Polaroid and complained about wasting film while still showing the images. August braided another length of twine into the arch. The repetition of small acts hardened into insurance. The child learned to trust a clock and a recipe as much as any single person. Those rituals taught that continuity can be manufactured by routine. There were darker stretches where envy and sorrow intermingled. I watched other families and felt the corrosive pinch of someone denied a clean inheritance. The ache sharpened sometimes. Yet envy also became spur. It motivated me to teach the curriculum we had invented, how to make an altar of attendance, how to convert humiliation into procedure, and how to draft legal paperwork without turning grief into a courtroom spectacle. The work was steady, tedious, and at times almost boring. Its steadiness produced a biography defined by accumulation rather than rupture. The found family's ethic was reciprocal. The child learned to ask for help and to repay it. They learned that solidarity is ordinary labor, answering the phone at midnight, driving someone to a rehearsal, bringing soup to a convalescent neighbor. They learned to treat privacy as precious and publicity as deliberate. That economy was not about fame, it was about sustaining life so that the sting of public humiliation could not be leveraged into profit or platform. There were one-off collisions to manage. Once a neighbor leaked a photo to a local blog with a dramatic, inaccurate caption. We asked for removal and the blog complied. There were attempts at monetization from outside. Reporters called in 2020 and 2021 offering exposure in exchange for detail. An internet commentator tried to reduce the Park Day to sensational hashtags. We refused each solicitation that required exposure. We continued to offer the checklist, the class, and occasional phone calls. Doing useful things for people without making ourselves into a product was a deliberate choice repeated over years. The child's learning was often practical rather than rhetorical. At 13 they wore an old boutonniere James found in a drawer and declared themselves found ambassador of the playground. They rearranged chairs, braided wildflowers into twine, and made a chair ready for someone else. When a friend asked why we baked the same lemon cake every June, the child answered simply, because someone promised. Their answer translated a moral grammar into a daily act. There were moments of moral clarity and difficult questions. Why did Grandma do that? The child asked once while stringing lights around the arch. I answered candidly, people make choices for complicated reasons, histories of trauma, fear, ego. Some choose humiliation, some choose presence. Our moral difference is in that choice. Explanation is often small and unsatisfying, but the requirement to act remains. We could not control motives, but we could control our responses. Over time, what began as triage grew into ritual and pedagogy. Between 2010 and 2022, I refused spectacle and relic. There is always a point when someone must decide whether to turn a wound into performance or to place it under glass and visit it as proof. I chose neither. I would not let private humiliation become fuel for someone else's platform, nor would I turn the experience into a weekly liturgy of suffering. Instead, I produced two kinds of labor: domestic ministries of cooking, attendance, and listening, and public, procedural work teaching others how to prevent and survive public erasure. I spoke at community centers, wrote checklists, and taught ceremonies without entitlement. My focus remained procedural: backups for vendors, witness affidavits, vendor terms specifying payment and notice, and scripts for handling confrontation without letting it go viral. These acts are not glamorous. They are what allow a ceremony to stand when someone tries to unmake it. Not everything could be administered away. The cousin who tried to use a funeral as a stage remained estranged. The internet stayed hungry for neat villains. But those things receded to scale. The work that mattered was repetitive and unglamorous. Making the lemon cake each June 12th, bringing a thermos, braiding a ribbon into the arch, and because it was repeated, it hardened into tradition. The rituals taught the child how to hold a life together minute by minute. 200 strangers who made the picnic and subsequent Saturdays into habit became kin by practice. Family, it turned out, had more to do with patience and predictable tasks than with genealogy. A recipe card taped to a fridge reads like a covenant when someone remembers to include a substitution for allergies. A thermos of tea on the hallway floor at 3 in the morning is proof of reliability. These acts, repeated, accumulated into fidelity, not heroic poetry, but the practice of keeping promises when keeping them is boring and ordinary. The chronology of care and teaching continued steadily: repeat rituals, refine paperwork, teach templates, host workshops. In 2012 and 2019, we returned to affidavit drafting and vendor clauses. The child learned to carry administrative tools in their pocket and to understand that a carefully worded email thread could be as steadfast as any witness on a pew. June 12, 2023, another June 12th arrived. Years after the cancellation and the re-wed picnic that gave us a second date, the child, older now, carrying both small wounds and the capacity to respond, rearranged 3 chairs and asked if we could add a new ribbon for people who keep their promises. We braided it into the arch. The wind took it quickly. A neighbor stooped, picked up the threads and re-wove them. It was not triumphal. It was the practical outcome of repetition. The 200 strangers who stood with us had not erased my mother's act. They had, instead, made the world survivable in ways that mattered more than apology or vindication. They taught the child, and through the child others, that fidelity is fabricated by practice. If there is a procedural moral to this chronology, it is simple and stubborn: build networks of care that are explicit and repeatable, inscribe intentions into legal and logistical forms so a single day's cruelty cannot be turned into a lasting weapon, and teach the next generation that family is action and a series of small practices, not merely a line on a birth certificate. Keep records. Name witnesses. Create redundancies. Make rituals small and repeatable. Teach children to be both administratively prepared and daily present. The altar we set is not carved marble. It is a table, a weekly phone call, a thermos of soup. These things, repeated, function as both boundary and blessing. They are what I intend to hand down. After the table, the thermos, the lemon cake and the recipe card, the chronology of care simply extended itself into years that insisted on being counted. June 12, 2024 came and went with the same modest machinery. Priya arrived with curry, James grumbled about film and still managed to force 3 usable Polaroids. The child, now older and accustomed to carrying a clipboard tucked into a messenger bag, set 3 chairs in a triangle and tied a ribbon that said, in their neat handwriting, "For people who keep their promises." We made a small announcement. No one was to record or post from the center of the ritual without explicit consent. People nodded. We baked the lemon cake. The neighbors rearranged the arch because storm had loosened one post. The ritual was neither triumphant nor consumptive, it simply occurred. The 200 strangers who had gathered in 2010 and who had become a habitual presence on subsequent Saturdays numbered themselves again in the quiet, like an inventory of people who preferred doing to pronouncing. In the months after June 12, 2024, the practices we had taught publicly began to institutionalize in modest ways. The ceremonies without entitlement class that I had started offering informally in community centers since 2011 became a regular evening workshop at the neighborhood library beginning in March 2024. We did not trademark the name. We did not want to commodify the grief or the procedures. We wanted access. A small grant from a local foundation, applied for in January and awarded in April, paid for a run of 1,000 free pamphlets. The pamphlet collected the forms and scripts we had refined over a dozen years, an affidavit template we first drafted in 2012 and adjusted after the 2015 blog incident. Vendor checklist revisions that incorporated the lessons of 2019, an email thread architecture appendix that laid out how to number messages and create headers so timestamps could be collated easily. The pamphlet included the same admonitions we had always made in conversation: keep the tone precise, name witnesses explicitly, attach photos with metadata intact. It included a one-page script for declining interviews that demanded a quid pro quo of exposure, and a sample letter to send to a reporter asking for corrections without threats. We printed at cost and distributed the pamphlets at the library, at the community center where Priya volunteered, and at the modest conservation group where James had once led a walk. We left stacks at the dentist's office, at the bakery across from the park, at a small church that had no signage on Sundays but which hosted a support group for new parents. People came to the workshops and brought notebooks. One woman who had been in the audience in 2014 when a reporter called came back and said simply, "This would have helped me." Small statements like that accumulated. We taught people how to draft a witness affidavit on the spot, and we let them take our paper copies home. We insisted each time that these procedures were not legal magic but practical redundancy, a chain of small acts that could resist a single person's attempt to erase a day. We kept records of our records. In July 2024, I scanned a sheaf of affidavits, those I had kept since 2010, and deposited them, with permission, into a locked digital archive at the community center. We catalogued them by date, by type of disruption, and by outcome. This archival labor felt necessary. The human memory is porous and the internet capricious, having a second-order memory, a chronological catalogue where each incident sat beside the remediation we had chosen, allowed us to see patterns. When a couple in late 2024 arrived at a workshop and described an invitation that had been rescinded on the eve of their event, we pulled up a case in the archive from 2015 and showed them how a succinct affidavit written on the same day, signed by a neighbor and 2 witnesses, could change the rhythm of potential disputes. That couple used the template. They rebuilt their guest list with the help of the phone trees we had taught people to make. They did not pursue litigation, they wanted a day to stand, and it did. There were collisions, as there always are. In December 2024, a freelance magazine contacted me asking for an essay in exchange for broad exposure. The pitch made the mistake of abstracting the story into a column about viral shaming culture, and positioned my mother as a flinty archetype. I declined. The magazine's editor called twice. I sent a careful note suggesting we could contribute a toolkit they could reproduce free of charge rather than a feature that turned private injury into spectacle. They did not take the offer. The refusal felt consistent with the ethic we had cultivated for years, to convert humiliation into procedure rather than into capital. When a larger journalist reached out in February 2025 proposing a documentary segment with a spendy crew and a character-driven narrative, we again refused. We offered a short filmed walkthrough of the affidavit templates instead. That offer was accepted on a limited basis by a small non-profit channel that agreed to run the segment without branding or sponsorship. Within a year, the pamphlet had been reproduced in 19 community libraries across the city and had been translated, by volunteers, into 2 additional languages used in the neighborhood. We did not claim credit when translation work was done, because credit had never been the point. We began to receive email from other cities asking if we would share our templates. We uploaded them to a simple, no-frills website hosted by the community center in May 2025, along with a short how-to video filmed in the park where the lemon cake once burned at the edges and was nonetheless declared perfect. The site's text emphasized the elemental list we had repeated since 2010: make rituals small and repeatable, make witness statements contemporaneous, keep the mundane acts of attendance as sacred as any solemn pronouncement. As the administrative arm of the found family expanded, the effective arm continued to deepen in unremarkable ways. Babies were born and baptisms were celebrated at the same picnic tables where a cancelled wedding had once been rehearsed and then unmade. There were funerals too, and when a neighbor's father died in October 2024, we gathered to bring soup and to make room. The found family learned the mechanics of accompaniment at scale, rotating meal trains, shared errands, a calendar for hospital visits coded with names and dietary restrictions. These tasks required list-making, the same skill we taught for ceremonies. One of the young people who had been at the park since they were a child, the one who had once declared themselves found ambassador, ran the meal train spreadsheets and resignedly adopted a handle on the group thread, logistics. It was, in its way, a promotion. The legal scaffolding we had developed was tested in 2025 when a small wedding at a nearby hall faced a threatened cancellation after a family dispute. The couple sought advice at a March workshop. Using the affidavit templates, the vendor contract checklist revised in 2019, and a reworked email thread script we had just posted online, the couple created a new set of redundancies. An explicit clause in the contract that required 30 days written notice for cancellation with defined penalties, an appointment with a mediator drawn from our network, a roster of witnesses authorized to receive communications. The vendor agreed to honor the contract. The family dispute was mediated in a way that preserved the ceremony's date. It was not a dramatic victory. There were concessions and awkward dinner tables afterward, but the day stood. These small wins mattered because they confirmed something we had suspected from the beginning. Procedural clarity reduces the ability of a single actor to convert humiliation into leverage. Meanwhile, the mother who had cancelled the wedding behind my back remained, in 2025, a presence we accounted for rather than a force we expected to be reconciled. There were conversations that flared and then cooled. There were times when forgiveness felt like a useful myth and times when it felt like a betrayal. The cousin who had attempted to weaponize a funeral as a stage remained estranged. Some relationships, despite the cumulative work of ritual and procedure, did not mend. We learned, slowly and unsentimentally, to accept that not all harms would be repaired by paperwork or by cake. There would be absences that no affidavit could rectify. The moral labor was not to require repair, but to arrange a life that could stand whether repair happened or not. In October 2025, the community center invited us to convene a one-day symposium called Attendance: Practical Tools for Ceremonial Resilience. We ran sessions on affidavit composition, on vendor clause literacy, on constructing phone trees, and on community-level practices for resisting monetization of private grief. The room contained people who had been at the park in 2010 and those who had come after, new members of the found family who had met us on social media and proceeded, cautiously, to become neighbors in the practical sense, people who brought soup to a bedside or who learned to measure flour for lemon cake. We published the symposium notes the following week. Copies were downloaded 300 times in the first month. Some readers wrote and said they were using the materials for retirement community events, for memorial committees at churches, and for high school civics classes. The reach remained small and clumsy. That was precisely the point. We did not evolve into a professionalized consultancy. In late 2025 we formalized a small cooperative instead, a not-for-profit with 4 volunteer board members drawn from the found family, registered as a community collective in December. The cooperative had no ambition to sell our methods. It simply existed to hold resources and to accept modest grants that would pay printing costs, childcare stipends for workshop attendees, and honoraria for translators. We established an ethics statement insisting that we would not accept money in exchange for public exposure of anyone's private harm, nor would we broker people's experiences into branded products. The cooperative's first act was to fund the printing of another 2,000 pamphlets, this time paying for a BIPOC-led translation. The second act was to underwrite a small emergency fund for couples and families who needed last-minute rental deposits when vendors tried to nullify agreements. The found family's pedagogy began to be taught to other networks in neighboring towns. In February 2026, a small municipal health department reached out asking if we would run a session for staff on attendance as public health. We accepted, because the language fit, continuity, small acts and reliable presence are, in a secular sense, basic infrastructure. The session focused on making rituals small, the maintenance of witness lists, and the practicalities of recording metadata on images. We brought the lemon cake and a thermos of tea. Attendees took notes. Afterward, a staffer murmured that their department was considering a pilot program to place copies of our pamphlet in family services offices. It was not a policy revolution, it was someone deciding bureaucratically that the small things we did were worth reproducing at scale. All of this administration and pedagogy did not close the wound that began with my mother's decision. It did not, for that matter, make the absence illegible. But over the years, the absence became perceptible in different ways. It was the gap at the head of the table at Thanksgiving. It was the decision not to mark May 1st. It was a private ledger of small disappointments. We taught the child, now a young adult and increasingly an organizer, to name that absence without letting it organize the rest of the calendar. The child taught younger people to bake lemon cake because baking is a way of attending when bodies are tired. We taught them to braid ribbons into arches because craft is a form of promise-keeping. Practical acts multiplied into social infrastructure. There were moments of recognition from unexpected quarters. A sociology professor at a state university reached out in late 2025 to ask whether they could include our pamphlet in a course on social networks and mutual aid. A local teacher printed copies for a unit on civic rituals. These adoptions were never about fame, they were about the steady invention of tools that made daily life survivable. As more institutions took an interest, the found family resisted a tendency toward simplification. We refused to let our practices be reduced to a slogan or an app. There is a temptation, offered often by people who enjoy tidy metaphors, to convert a complex social practice into a product. We declined that trajectory. What we did not decline was the pedagogical imperative. In January 2026, we revised the pamphlet's appendix on digital hygiene to reflect how people were sharing images and messages in the mid-2020s. Two-factor authentication suggestions, instructions for preserving photo metadata across different phone models, a short explainer about how to export an email conversation as a PDF with intact timestamps. These were prosaic details, but they mattered in the same way that braided ribbon mattered. They were practice applied to vulnerability. The chronology, measured in lemon cakes and archived affidavits, kept advancing. June 12, 2026 Saturday on the horizon, like any other date we had decided to inhabit. We planned to braid another ribbon, to bring a thermos, to bake another cake, and to teach another class the week after. The found family would continue to be defined by repetition rather than revelation, attendance over pageantry, procedure over personality. There would be more workshops, more pamphlets, more small acts of repair. There would also be inevitable failures, guests who would not show, vendors who would misunderstand a clause, journalists who would still want spectacle. We would meet these failures with the same tools we had been building: conversation, documents, redundancy, and a stubborn insistence that family was action. The altar we set, a kitchen table, a calendar, a reliably warm cup of tea, would be there, durable not because it was monumental but because it was practiced, and because the people who gathered to keep it would keep learning how to pass those practices on. June 12, 2026 arrived much like any other date we had taught ourselves to inhabit, without fanfare but with a quiet accumulation of small preparations. We gathered at the park near the picnic tables where the lemon cake had once browned at the edges and been declared perfect anyway. There was a new banner this time, a length of ribbon grown thick with the knots and braids of half a decade. Someone had sewn a pocket on its underside to hold our printed affidavits, laminated and zip-tied to a ring so anyone could flip through them. The morning was cool. The thermos of tea that had become a talisman for our workshops steamed into the air. We set a table for witnesses, not an altar but a ledger, and we placed a calendar there with June 12 circled because we had chosen to keep choosing it, not because it commemorated a single rupture, but because it marked a practice. We conducted a brief ceremony, a reading from the pamphlet's introduction, a minute of naming the absences we had learned to live with, and then a lesson on redundancy, how to spell out vendor requirements in plain language, how to confirm 3 different contact methods for a person expected to be present, and why a witness roster with consecutive initials mattered in court as much as it did at a picnic bench. 2 babies crawled under the table and were gently dragged back to the circle. Someone offered slices of a lemon cake that was browned but, as ever, declared perfect. The child who had long since evolved into an organizer, the one who made attendance into a job without becoming a professional, read a new clause we had been testing in putative vendor language, a simple, consumer-friendly restatement of a cancellation penalty, a line that read, in part, vendor to reimburse deposit within 30 days if cancellation is unauthorized, and then she explained in plain speech what unauthorized might mean in practice. It was a day that would not have been news to many outside our park, but for those seated at the table it felt like public administration performed in daylight. After June 12, the schedule bent toward the ordinary intensification that marks projects reaching their second decade: more requests for workshops, more translations, more of the small nitty-gritty that keeps a social practice from calcifying. In July 2026, we were asked to run a 4-hour session at a retirement community where residents wanted guidance on how to record witness statements for simple, neighborhood-scale ceremonies. The module we had originally written in 2010, make rituals small and repeatable, make witness statements contemporaneous, keep the mundane acts of attendance as sacred as any solemn pronouncement, fit surprisingly well into eldercare policy. A social worker purchased a stack of our BIPOC translated pamphlets to distribute at the front desk. A resident taught the group a hymn that had been sung at their own unceremonious wedding in 1962. The room was small, the demographics unexpected, the result the same. People learned a few new phrases and left thinking differently about the practicalities of presence. In November 2026, the cooperative accepted a modest grant from a regional community foundation expressly to expand childcare stipends for workshop attendees. The board of 4, as we had registered in December 2025, met in a church basement to decide how to allocate the funds. We distributed the stipends in amounts shaped to cover a sitter for 2 hours, prioritizing single parents and people who worked night shifts. The ethics statement we had drafted the month we formalized the cooperative guided every decision. No exposure for sale, no conversion of trauma into brandable content, no brokerage of private stories for publicity. A journalist called in January 2027 asking for an interview about our refusal to scale up via a corporate platform. We declined politely, offering instead to send them a pamphlet and an invitation to a workshop. The cooperative's emergency fund, seeded at registration and modestly bolstered by the grant, saw its first significant use on March 3, 2027. A couple from a neighboring town informed us that a vendor had cited a supposed clause in a contract that the vendor claimed allowed unilateral cancellation for family emergency, and promptly attempted to rebook the hall for the following week. Using the vendor checklist we had revised in 2019 and the template email thread we had posted after the March 2025 case, the couple contacted our network. We wired enough money from the emergency fund to cover the shortfall in the rental deposit while the mediator we recommended, a person who had worked with us since the October 2025 symposium, convened a meeting with the family and the vendor. The meeting resulted in a mediated agreement. The vendor would re-rent the hall to the couple at a slightly elevated rate, the vendor would apologize in writing, and the couple would accept a negotiated partial refund of their deposit. It was not an ideal ending. It was, like so many of our interventions, a practical halting of harm. The fund and the documents had done what they were designed to do, buy time and set a floor below which humiliation could not easily fall. Throughout 2027, there were many such small instances that cumulatively changed the texture of local civic life. Schools asked for a 2-hour unit on ceremonial literacy for high school civics classes. A parish council invited the cooperative to workshop funeral logistics. A municipal parks department reached out to formalize a permit process allowing neighborhood memorials at a particular grove of trees if groups submitted a witness roster and a trash plan. Each adoption was prosaic rather than spectacular, and each reproduced the logic we had tried to make legible since 2010, build redundancy, normalize small rituals, and treat attendance as an infrastructural act rather than a theatrical one. The mother who had cancelled my wedding remained, as she had been characterized in 2025, a presence we accounted for rather than a force we expected to reconcile. There were intermittent messages across the years, a birthday card mailed without signature in 2028, an SMS in 2029 that read only, "Hope you are well." Moments that produced temporary flares of conversation and then retreated. Forgiveness remained uneven and at times felt like a social salve that could be more harmful than helpful. There were periods when it felt like a useful fiction and periods when it felt like betrayal. The cousin who had attempted to weaponize a funeral remained estranged by choice. We learned to stop treating repair as an inevitable arc. Instead, we learned to plan for lives that could be durable without it. The child, who had moved from baking lemon cake to running logistics spreadsheets and then to organizing workshops, learned alongside us to name absences without allowing them to govern entire calendars. In public, the child was often addressed as organizer or found family ambassador. The handle logistics that they had adopted on the group thread became, over time, a kind of affectionate job title, and in private they taught younger people how to braid ribbons because craft, they insisted, is a promise you can practice. By late 2027, we were being consulted by a city working group on mutual aid. They wanted to pilot a program that placed copies of the pamphlet in all family service offices and trained a handful of staff in attendance maintenance. How to manage witness rosters, how to suggest modest rituals to grieving families, how to preserve photo metadata so that images could be used as contemporaneous evidence if necessary. The municipal pilot launched in May 2028 with a staff training that borrowed heavily from our January 2026 revision on digital hygiene, two-factor authentication, preservation of EXIF metadata, and simple instructions for exporting email threads as PDFs with intact timestamps. These were banal technicalities, but in the months after the pilot launched they proved useful. A family services caseworker used our checklist to reconstruct a failing chain of communications when insurance companies disputed a claim related to a ceremonial cancellation. Procedural clarity mattered in administrative and legal settings as much as it did at park picnic tables. Concomitantly, the found family kept resisting professionalization. In 2028 we turned down an offer from a national nonprofit to create branded attendance kits, and refused an invitation from a well-known app developer to turn our witness roster into a subscription service. Both offers came with checks that could have funded a full-time staff, but the ethics statement that had guided the cooperative since December 2025 forbade the monetization of other people's harms. We made calculations about scale that were, at times, politically naive. We chose to remain small, to preserve the relational labor of the work rather than convert it into intellectual property. That choice cost us some potential reach, but it preserved the practices that made the work legible to ordinary people. There were, of course, failures. In August 2028, a vendor misread a clause and briefly elided a deposit return, producing a short legal scramble we could not entirely smooth. Journalists occasionally persisted in searching for scandal. One piece in late 2028 framed us as a movement of repair in an article that flattened nuance into a convenient narrative arc. We responded in a letter to the editor pointing out the facts. The cooperative had 4 volunteer board members and had printed 2,000 pamphlets in late 2025 with funds used to underwrite translations and emergency deposits. We had declined offers to commercialize our methods, and our measured reach was the product of deliberate decisions rather than accidental modesty. The editor published our corrections and an addendum. The reporter, gracefully or otherwise, acknowledged that the work looked different at the granular level than it did in the tidy column inches of feature writing. By 2029, the practices we taught were taught by others. A regional network of mutual aid organizers invited us to a convening in March 2029 to explain how to set up a local emergency fund, how to steward translation partnerships with BIPOC-led groups, and how to maintain the seemingly contradictory commitments of durability and humility. A few people in the room had been at the park in 2010. Others had only recently discovered us via a pamphlet found on a social worker's desk. We worked through exercises, drafting vendor clauses in plain language, composing witness statement templates keyed to different legal regimes, and constructing phone trees that accounted for migration and privatized numbers. The room contained the small, civic-minded people who had, in their own towns, begun to see continuity as a public good. There were civic recognitions too. In April 2029, the Municipal Health Department that had hosted our February 2026 session made the pamphlet part of a small public health campaign focused on loneliness and continuity. The campaign did not transform hospital policy overnight, but at neighborhood clinics nurses began to carry laminated checklists in their pockets. A nurse in a clinic 3 neighborhoods away once told me, quietly, that she used the witness roster model to help a patient designate a friend who could be called upon to accompany them during a difficult series of medical appointments. That single practical act was, for her, a vindication of a philosophy she did not have language for until she read our pamphlet. Over the same period, we continued to practice the mundane arts. Lemon cakes were baked, browned on the edges and nonetheless declared perfect. Ribbons were braided and braided again. Witness lists were kept in notebooks that smelled faintly of tea and pastry. Babies were held at the same picnic tables that had once held rehearsed vows. There were baptisms and funerals and, quietly, anniversaries that would have gone unmarked had we not taught the neighborhood to think of attendance as infrastructure. When a neighbor's father died in October 2029, an echo of the October 2024 bereavement that had taught us how to carry each other with soup and space, the meal train spreadsheets were activated and the person on the group thread with the handle logistics quietly reassigned tasks and notes. The found family had learned, in the decade since 2010, how to operationalize accompaniment at scale without losing the low ceremony ethic that had sustained the project from the beginning. Personal reckonings remained partial. From time to time, the mother's presence produced a ripple, overheard at a grocery store, a handshake on a street corner, a brief and awkward conversation at a cousin's wedding where the cousin who had once weaponized a funeral remained absent. Some relationships healed in small increments, Others hardened into new forms of absence that required their own rites of recognition. We continued to teach the child how to make space for grief without making it the axis of life. They taught younger people to braid ribbons and to respect the mundane as a form of promise-keeping. We rehearsed, in successive summers, how to live with absences that could not be papered over, and how to make the calendar hospitable to the people who actually arrived. As public institutions paid more attention, our pedagogy changed in technical ways and in spirit. We added an appendix to the pamphlet in 2030, a modest guide to archiving community records in a manner compatible with municipal retention policies. And we worked with a local archivist to recommend storage protocols that balanced accessibility with privacy. We recognized that institutionalization risked eroding the intimacy of practices we wanted to preserve. We attempted to design the appendices so that they could be used by a city clerk and by a neighbor who had never filed a form. The cooperative remained small, still 4 volunteer board members, still a reluctance to accept money that would require us to sell stories, still an emergency fund set to respond to immediate, localized threats. There are markers I can list that would make this sound like a tidy progression: dates, small programmatic wins, the slow adoption of practices by municipal departments, but those markers are only scaffolding for the real work, which was the slow accretion of habit. The lemon cake, the thermos of tea, the braided ribbon, the witness roster. These were not symbols in a textbook sense, but the actual machinery by which people began to show up for one another more reliably. The found family did not become an institution so much as a habit cultivated in public spaces and in private kitchens. It was an infrastructural ethic translated into material means. The work will continue. There will be more pamphlets printed, perhaps another translation, a new revision to accommodate yet another operating system for phones, a mediation that will require the emergency fund, a funeral that will test our rotas. There will be people who arrive late and people who do not arrive at all. There will be more invitations from teachers and social workers and municipal employees. There will be more refusals to commercial offers. We will continue to accept small grants and to refuse anything that would require us to expose someone's harm as a marketing device. We will keep teaching the child, now a young adult whose spreadsheets still bear the handle logistics, how to name an absence without letting it organize a life. We will keep baking lemon cake that burns a little at the edges and tastes like fidelity. We will keep the calendar and the thermos and the braided ribbon, and we will keep learning how to pass these practical, stubborn rituals on to the next person who asks for them. In the winter of 2031, a small city council meeting convened in a room with bad acoustics and an earnest clerk who kept offering us extra chairs. We had been invited because someone on the health department staff remembered the laminated checklist and wanted to talk about scaling a neighborhood-by-neighborhood version of the pilot they'd run in 2028. We brought copies of the 2030 appendix. The archivist had printed them on thicker paper, and a thermos of tea. That day we agreed, tentatively and with coffee stains on the margins, to translate the pamphlet into Spanish and Mandarin and to produce a version with larger type for older hands. The funding for that work came from a pair of modest municipal grants awarded in March and October 2031. They were not enough to hire staff, but they paid for printing and for a stipend that allowed one of the volunteers to take unpaid leave for 2 months to coordinate translators. The cooperative remained, in principle and in practice, volunteer-run. In fact, the stipend was structured so the cooperative could decline ongoing payroll obligations. We were insistent, still, that labor be recognized without turning care into a commodity. By December 2031, the roster that had begun, a decade earlier, as a scribble on the back of a park flyer had quietly grown. More than 200 different people had, at one time or another, been listed as attendees or witnesses on rosters we circulated publicly or privately. Some of those 200 people signed on for a single funeral, others had rotated through multiple show-ups, bringing casseroles or a knitting kit or simply an on-call phone presence. The number, 200, became a shorthand we used at meetings to remind ourselves that scale is not the same as institutional depth. 200 was both small and enormous. Small because even at that number we were locally bound. Enormous because 200 is a crowd that can, intentionally, be family. In the spring of 2032, an appellate court in the region referenced our pamphlet in a ruling about the admissibility of contemporaneous digital records generated by non-professionals. The judge's language was careful, procedural, almost anonymous, but the transcripts quoted our recommendations about preserving EXIF data and two-factor authentication. The ruling did not transform any area of law. it did not confer new rights on friends. What it did do was make visible, in legal terms, the fact that ordinary people could preserve a chain of evidence that mattered to bureaucracies. We published a small note in our newsletter the following month with the quote underlined in purple ink. The quote became, for a while, a talisman for volunteers who entered courts or insurers' offices with a cold printout and a warm casserole. The mid-decade years, 2033 to 2035, were a period of careful consolidation. We accepted a series of small, targeted grants from local foundations that had neither the reach nor the appetite to demand narrative rights. Those grants, granted in November 2033 and May 2034, paid for an expanded printing run, 10,000 pamphlets this time, some distributed through social service desks, some dropped in parish halls, and for a part-time administrative fellowship that allowed the person with the handle logistics to be paid for the first time in a capacity that did not feel like selling out. The fellowship was not a salaried job with benefits. It was a one-year contract to support the cooperative's bookkeeping and to coordinate trainings. Logistics accepted the position in September 2034 and, true to form, negotiated a clause that allowed the fellow to step away for ritual baking duties and ribbon lessons. There were strained moments. In January 2034, a regional tech incubator approached us with a proposal to build an app that would automate witness rosters. The prototype they showed us had slick UX slides and an optimistic revenue model predicated on premium features. We were invited to a demo in a glass room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaning fluid. We refused, politely but firmly, explaining that our ethics statement, the one ratified in December 2025, forbade the conversion of other people's harms into private profit. The incubator pivoted to another idea. The refusal cost us potential funding and, if honest, a flatter organizational life. It also preserved the atmosphere in which a neighbor could ask someone to be a witness without wondering which corporate terms they had unwittingly accepted. The personal geometry of relationships remained complex. My mother's absence, the incident that first set the found family into motion, was, by 2035, a presence that had assumed many shapes. Sometimes her absence appeared as a public story, a cousin in a flossy dress asking, loudly and with a laugh, why we needed so many witnesses for a small celebration. Sometimes it appeared in private, a text that arrived on a weekday morning, brief and inscrutable, that read simply, "We should talk." I learned over the years to answer these invitations cautiously, to let someone read a room and a calendar before attempting reconciliation. In the spring of 2035, after a small side email exchange with my mother, a neutral mediator suggested a meeting. It was scheduled in a library conference room with a pot of overbrewed coffee and 2 city mediators. We did not reconcile in any cinematic sense. We did not sign a peace treaty. We did, however, rearrange some expectations about who could be invited and who would be given space. The found family, that cluster of 200-plus acquaintances and friends, bore witness by attending the small, low-key brunch that followed. They were witnesses not to a legal document but to a fragile and ongoing attempt at repair. Disasters tested the method in ways none of us had anticipated. In late summer 2036, a series of flash floods struck neighborhoods where many of our volunteers lived. Houses were inundated, community centers lost basements. The cooperative activated the emergency fund in August 2036 to underwrite immediate needs, replacing ruined documents, buying a piano from the salvage store so the church could host wakes, and underwriting refundable deposits so families could afford to secure a venue for memorials. The fund covered a refundable deposit for a memorial service in September 2036 for a neighbor whose close kin lived out of state. The city, stretched thin with its own disaster response, borrowed our rosters to assemble volunteer teams for home visits. We declined any formal merger but accepted a mutual aid protocol that allowed us to route requests for help through the municipality's call center. The coordination was messy and human and utterly necessary. It proved, with grim clarity, that attendance infrastructure matters in moments when institutions falter. Academia began to notice us in a shallow way and, occasionally, with more seriousness. In 2037, a sociologist published an ethnography that spent 3 chapters on our public rituals and 1 chapter on the lemon cake. The book's title was woozier than our actual work. The study's methodology was thoughtful and its citations careful. We hosted the author for a public discussion in August 2037 at a community college. The conversation was civil and included a question about scalability that I remember because logistics laughed and answered, "We are not trying to scale the way one scales a coffee franchise. We are trying to pass the technique." The phrase passed into our vernacular, technique, not franchise. It became a guiding line for younger volunteers who wanted to formalize everything into a curriculum. We built a modest Train the Trainer series in late 2037 that taught neighborhood leaders how to replicate the practices without insisting on centralized control. The question of narrative ownership recurred. In October 2037, a radio documentary sought to tell the origin story: the wedding cancelled behind my back, the park, the soup, and the producer asked for a dramatized reenactment. We agreed to on-air interviews but declined the reenactment. The story was ours to tell, not to monetize someone else's grief. The documentary aired with an emphasis on community practice. It used our language but did not sensationalize the mother's absence. After the broadcast, we received emails from strangers in other states asking for pamphlets, for training, for advice. We answered, slowly and with caution. In February 2038, we mailed 20 packets of materials and a modest guide for local adaptation to a mutual aid group in a small Rust Belt city. Their coordinator later emailed a photograph of a braided ribbon on a community altar. The altar was simple and, in the photograph, perfectly imperfect. The image traveled through our thread and anchored a new habit, seeing our practices used in places that were not ours to own. By mid-2038, the cooperative's administrative decisions were infused with institutional memory. We had learned to write grant language that protected privacy and to draft translation agreements that ensured translators would not publish other people's stories. We had learned, usually the hard way, that small procedural shifts, adding a line in a form, requesting an acknowledgement for a translation, could have outsized ethical impacts. We updated the pamphlet again in June 2038 to include a short